Okay, we'll get started. Welcome. My name is Katie Burrows, and I am one of the coordinators of the Columbia Basin Watershed Network. The Watershed Network acts as a regional umbrella organizations for organizations working on watershed stewardship to share experiences and resources and build knowledge and expertise in the Canadian Columbia Basin. Today is our third webinar in our winter webinar series. And we are joined by communications specialist Dave Minko with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, and he's going to discuss freshwater storytelling as a meaningful way to build connections with your audience. This webinar is hosted in partnership with the Kootenay Conservation Program. The Kootenay Conservation Program is a broad partnership of organizations from across the Kootenays that works to conserve landscapes that sustain naturally functioning ecosystems. We are really excited about this partnership as it's an opportunity for both organizations to bring together our membership and build capacity amongst water and conservation groups across the Columbia Basin. There are two remaining sessions in our webinar series. On February 12th, Deb McKillop will be delivering a session on the BC Biogeoclimatic Ecosystem Classification System. And on March 10th, Dr. Hans Schreier will be discussing emerging issues in mountain watershed management. So you can visit the CBWN or the KCP website to register for these sessions. And also, if you've missed the last two sessions, you can watch recordings of these on our websites as well. I will be administering this webinar, so if you have any technological issues or concerns, please send me a message and I'll do my best to address them. Also, if you lose your connection or you're removed from the webinar for any reason, click on the link that was provided when you registered and it should plug you back into the session. Thank you in advance for your patience. We have about 40 registrants for this session, so there's quite a few folks on the line. You will notice that the participants have been placed on a blanket mute, and this has been done to avoid background noise and feedback. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat box. Dave is going to enlighten us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So you're welcome to post your questions and thoughts throughout the presentation, but we'll wait to address them during the question period at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dave, the communication specialist with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance. He describes himself as a veteran print and broadcast journalist, including more than a decade of public radio, as a public radio producer in San Francisco. Most recently, Dave has been an editor for Climate Access, a network for climate communication, communicators trying to engage the public and influence policy. He has a Master's of Science in Journalism from Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Duke University. So thanks for joining us, David, and I'm just going to pass the presenter controls on to him.
Sounds good. Let me show my screen. Great, welcome. Thanks very much, Katie, for the introduction and for the invitation. It's great to be here. I met Katie during an engagement organizing training we did last June that included a fair bit of storytelling. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Alliance, the Freshwater Alliance, we help groups, big and small, working to build their capacity to protect Canada's lakes, rivers, and streams. And we focus our work on a few core areas, and storytelling is one of them. As you see here, we talk about theory of change, social media, your database, and analysis. And the reason why storytelling is just a big part of it is because it's kind of essential, right? It's a great way to motivate action for freshwater protection, and it's something that not all that many freshwater groups do very well. But to move forward on all your plan to engage people, you need to have stories are just a powerful way. So what I'm going to share with you today, I've learned through trial and error telling stories as a journalist, by participating in trainings and doing some research, and by living out a fable. I don't know how many of you know the story of Stone Soup. Perhaps you read it as a kid. I didn't learn it until I was in my late 20s. That's when I had a vision of putting together a homegrown festival slash fundraiser, and I introduced two of my friends, Ted and Jeff, who I thought would be interested in the idea. And after I rambled a bit about the vision I had for it, Jeff asked if we knew the story of stone soup. And since neither Ted or I had, Jeff proceeded to tell the story. As you can see, there's many versions in many different cultures, but the essential idea is that travelers come to a village that's been through hard times, and after being for food, they start to cook stones in a pot. And then curious villagers are told that it would be better with a little salt, some onion, and so on, which the villagers gradually supply, and they end up learning the power of sharing after they have a big feast. So when Jeff finished, we knew we were going to create an event called the soup, where everyone would be an ingredient, would bring an ingredient and be an ingredient. So without that story of stone soup and our story of deciding to make stone soup, we had just an idea and intention, or I did at least. And many of you have great ideas and plans, and you use words to describe them. But without story, it can be very hard to engage audiences. The soup is still going strong 20 years later, but I don't know if year one would even have happened without the metaphor of stone soup. It was an easy way to explain to people who didn't know it, and for people who shared the values of the story, which included building community, helping others, hopefulness. It was a shortcut to conveying things they already felt. And even for those who didn't want to attend, they got and remembered the gist of what we were trying to do because we have the story. So speaking of stones, storytelling has been around at least since the Stone Age. So today we're going to look at why storytelling is so good at moving people to action. So today's not just about stories, just to entertain, but it's about how we can move people to action. And today we're going to look at how you give you some ideas on how you can get better at doing it. The good news is that storytelling is integral to who we are. Here's a quote that I found a while back. We live in story like a fish lives in water. We swim through words and images, siphoning story through our minds the way a fish siphons water through its gills. We cannot think without language. We cannot process experience without story. And then another thing that I found, so stories are all around us. So just to prove it, just look how much storytelling is used to motivate audiences to take action, whether it's to buy products, to cast your votes, and to get engaged on an issue. And I think more and more people are getting that, the power of stories. It still takes some work to figure out how to do it well, but it is all around us. And this list of why stories work, we'll just kind of do a little overviews before we move on to other things and how to do it. But this list I found, storytelling is simple because anyone can do it. You don't need to be, it's helpful to have this kind of a training, but you don't need to be an experienced orator. We all can do stories. It's timeless. It's always worked and always will in the Stone Age. Everybody likes listening to stories. They're demographic proof, right? Regardless of your age, race, or gender, stories resonate. And they're contagious. They can spread like wildfire without any additional effort on the part of the person telling the story. And you have to be okay with that too. Some stories will take on a life of their own. Stories are easy to remember. You'll probably remember some stories from today's presentation more than anything else. And they appeal to all kinds of learners, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. Visual learners get mental pictures that storytelling evokes. Auditory learners focus on the words and the storyteller's voice. And kinesthetic learners remember the emotional connections and feelings from the story, which I think everybody will remember those emotions as well, and we're going to be talking about them more in a little bit. It's the bedrock of informal learning of storytelling. So it's not just your formal way that we do it in your work. And stories put the listener in a mental learning mode, because listeners who are in a critical or evaluative mode are more likely to reject what's being said. So that's a big idea, that you're more receptive that way than when you're when you hear something and it's like an argument and you might want to argue back, but your storytelling is different. And it gets your message across without arrogantly telling listeners what to think, right? Telling stories shows respect for the audience. So there's a formula that makes a good story, and this was developed by Marshall Gans. This is Gans' method of public narrative. And Marshall Gans is a guy who been a long-time civil rights activist. He worked with Cesar Chavez back in the 1960s, and then later became a professor at Harvard and became a key advisor during Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. And the formula that he has, it's a very simple formula. It's values plus emotion is what leads to action. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of on the emotional front. You know, the emotions are what make people care. You want to make people feel something and not just think something. So to give you a little science stuff here, I know that a lot of you guys have a good science background, but so our brains do different things when they're on stories. So without getting into too much of the technical stuff, but when we consume uninteresting information, like we listen to a presentation with boring bullet points, a certain part of our brain, called the Wernicke's area, is activated. This translates the word into meaning. And that's about all that happens. The stories are different. Narratives activate many other parts of our brains as well. So words like lavender, cinnamon, and soap, they elicit a response not only from the language processing areas of our brains, but also those that are for dealing with smells. And stories describing emotion, they cause our neurons to fire the same way they would if you were doing the actual action being talked about. And then there's the amygdala. When the brain detects an emotionally charged event, so an area of our brain, as you see there, that's a small part called the amygdala, it releases dopamine into the system. Because dopamine helps us with memory and information processing, it creates kind of a post-it note that reads, you know, remember this. So when we think about our heart, it's actually this part of the brain. And you know, when you think about emotions, I mean, I grew up thinking that facts were what ruled, that you could convince someone just by facts. When I was a little kid, grade 2, Watergate happened. I was born in the U.S., and for me, that was fascinating. I just remember coming home from school, couldn't wait to watch the Watergate hearings, and just that these reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, these guys got the facts out and exposed the lies and other things. And there's a picture of Nixon as he was leaving office right after resigning. But that was what really, the facts ruled. Then it was the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who's known as the Great Communicator. This is him when he was back in his radio days, and he did, in addition to movies, he did television. He was a master at telling stories. He used anecdotes, and his narrative, I mean, he created, they were called the Reagan Democrats. These were people who believed in him, felt connected to him, even if his policies went against their self-interest. And I think, I mean, I think for a long time I still kept holding on to the idea that facts went, but this was an early example of how emotions and how the storytelling could really influence people in a way that that facts could. So again, like I mentioned earlier, that trying to convince people of a message, you know, puts them in a position of evaluating, arguing back. But stories engage people. So what Reagan was so good at doing, he was connecting with these shared values. So the social values, and these are how people interpret experiences, politics, and culture. These are basically our worldviews, and they're developed. They're often fairly developed by the time we're 15 or so, and they don't change a whole lot unless there's a big traumatic event in your life. So you've got these worldviews, and they're at least as influential as demographics are on predicting behavior. It's your social values, it's how you see the world. So you can have a very different demographic than somebody else and see the world in the same way as they do, and then someone else who's from your same culture and age may have an opposite view just because of how they were raised, other things that are inherent to them, all these influences, teachers, and experiences that shapes how we see things, just how when you look at, same people, depending on what political party you ascribe to, that when you hear Stephen Harper saying something, you kind of interpret it in a different way. And then this, by the way, this picture I found, because I was only trying to find things that I could use that are not copyrighted, but there was a photo on here from this New Zealand party called the Values Party in the 1970s. So just understand the importance of values. I had something I didn't put on my resume here was that I had a job, very interesting job after I left journalism and moved to Canada, actually working for an American company that did something called Environics, where I would be given information on people's values as well as demographics, and this company would be hired by progressive groups working on the death penalty, national security, different issues, and they wanted to divide up the population into different segments, and so you try to think about who these different people were, and I would write up a profile based on this information and what their social values were. So although most of these are private and they can't be shared, here's an example of, again, this is U.S., but this is an environmental segmentation. So the idea is that you can divide, and when I would be asked to do this, sometimes it would be anywhere between 6 and 15 different ways. There's different ways you can slice it up by the values and things that they wanted. So here is one that was done in the U.S. looking at environmental values, and there was 10 segments. And and by doing the research, you would identify the values that they were the strongest, but also ones that you could tap that would fit with the cause that I was being asked to research on. So here you have, there were 3 groups that had pretty much a high priority in the environment, but often we focus on just the ones that are the closest to ourselves. And so a lot of environmental methods in the United States go to the greenest Americans. And sometimes the things that the greenest Americans like can actually be turn-off for other groups that actually do care about the environment, but we don't think about them and don't think about their values and try to take advantage of them in terms of connecting with them. So, and really, actually, from doing this work, other than a few segments, even though some of the ones on the bottom, there actually are ways to connect with them. There's one that the cruel worlders, we called it, that they weren't really going to come on board anytime soon with environmental stuff. But it's a real important thing to think about these values and how you can connect to them. And then the key is when you're thinking about your audience. So you want to think about who your audience is for your story, because it's not, because you want to really target it, because there isn't a general public out there. So you want to think about the different ones you want. So, and at the same time, you want to remember that you are not your audience. Just like that example with the greenest Americans, that maybe you're, and even you, as someone who's committed to working on freshwater issues, are different in probably many ways than those people who aren't doing that. So these are important things to remember as we start breaking down who your audience is. And so it's helpful to do an exercise of building your profile, again, for your stories, who you want to reach. For example, this U.S. grocery store chain, the Trader Joe's, they have a very specific person. They go after, their idea is an unemployed college professor who drives a very, very used Volvo. So you want to think about who your audience is. Okay, so as part of doing that, you want to consider, what do you know about them? Their demographics, what kind of job they do, or how they support themselves, the activities they do for fun, what matters most to them. Many do care about freshwater issues. There's polling that we've done that shows that a very, very high percentage of people in BC and in Canada really care about it. It's just not always their top priority. There's other, economy and jobs and health and other things tend to trump it, but even though they do care about the environment. So you want to consider, why might they care about your issue? And why might they not care? So again, these are kind of things you want to go through with your thinking about your audience. Okay, so you have people in mind. When I was a journalist, I had certain people that I knew or I came across that I kind of had a vision of when I would do my stories. And again, that was more, supposedly the general public, but even they're having a very specific thing. But when your work, you do want to think about different segments of the population, and there's a lot of people out there who aren't on board. You might not think about them, but they actually do have a lot of values that you can connect to. Okay, so now you want to break down your story. Now it's time to outline it. Okay, so you want to identify what the purpose is. What's your goal? Do you want to get out the vote? Do you want to raise money? And then what's the big idea? What is your main idea? And it helps if your organization has done some framing work, which is the idea that you've come up with some overall frames for your organization that will help you identify whether or not you want to do certain campaigns and tell certain stories, but how they fit. So you've already kind of got those. But you want to have this, what is your big idea? And sometimes it's easy, you don't want to have too many ideas, you want to, or there may be many ideas, but you want to have that core idea. There may be a proverb that you're able to use to say it. But it's really easy to get lost in all the complexities of the issue that you're working on, but to boil it down to one big main idea. So as part of figuring out your story, you want to figure out what the challenge is, what's the problem, what's the overarching threat. Kind of write down what is the challenge. Write that out clearly, and then identify what's at stake. What are the shared values that are impacted? And so having a good sense of that and being clear on what that is will help you move forward. So what? So why should your audience care? What's the urgency? And why now? So you've got to answer those questions because there's always lots of issues out there, but you want to make it clear. And again, so just write that down when you're kind of outlining your story. So who or what is the villain and the obstacle? Is it a specific corporation? Is it just going to be government, lack of regulations? But think about that as you weave that through your story. And who's your anti-hero or your hero? The anti-hero can be someone like a Shrek who ends up being the hero, but wasn't really inclined to do it. But who's your hero? A big hint would be that's a good idea to make your audience the hero when you can, because you're trying to engage them to do something, and so to address that challenge, right? Because there's a choice. So what's the choice? What actions are needed to solve the problem? What can the audience do? Think about that. And then you want to present the outcome as well as the negative outcome. The negative outcome is what happens if you don't act, and you want to paint that vision of what can happen if people make the choice that you're recommending, and what is it like to overcome that challenge. And a little similar to the big idea, but actually a little bit different, is it's what's the moral of the story. So after you've kind of figured out all the things and the different pieces of it, what is the moral of the story? There's a book that I read, it's a book called Winning the Story Wars, the Jonas Sachs, and it has a lot about, it makes the moral is a key element, right? His quote is, the moral is the core message that underlies, sometimes subtly and sometimes overtly, every story you tell. The moral can be dressed up in any number of plots, characters, and forms, but it should always be there, providing meaning and consistency to your communications. And he lists a few examples here of morals of the story. I threw in the Little Red Hen here, but just, all these kind of childhood stories have those kinds of things, as well as something like Stone Soup. But here's one: the Tea Party. The moral there is powerful elites are stealing America. Real people can see the back. While Occupy Wall Street is powerful corporations are stealing the world. Real people can see the back. The Obama campaign that Marshall Gans worked on, working hard together. Problems, and I don't know if you are familiar with the story itself, but those examples I gave were just the moral is you can understand a complex, broken system, and once you do, you can help fix it. Okay, so once you have that, It's story time. You've done the outline. Now you got to think about how best to say it. And again, you don't have to be the best storyteller in terms of your experience. You can all do this. One of the biggest challenges is this reversing the curse of knowledge. This is another book that I'd recommend. It's called Made to Stick: Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. And when they updated this book, the authors wished they had emphasized this barrier even more. The curse of knowledge, which is basically the difficulty of remembering what it was like to not know something. So in your work, and it's easy to speak the jargon if you're doing the science work or your advocacy language, but it's really easy to forget about. It's very hard about what other people know and don't know. That you know things that they just don't understand. And so just to keep that in mind, kind of have this beginner's mind of how you would tell it to a child. I realize when I talk to my kids, I mean, there's a different way that I explain things. And so, obviously the child's not your audience, but I definitely consider that because this curse of knowledge will hold up. And so one way to do that is to make it tangible. Make people feel that they can see and feel an idea. So use very simple, concrete language. Another thing is you can get lost in statistics. Well, it's a lot better to make comparisons and use analogies when you're doing that to make those statistics on something that people can relate to. So reverse the curse of knowledge. So make it relatable. And often it's just a way to connect with on a personal level with people because there's that the old quote that Stalin actually didn't say, but one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. But whenever you can, whether or not it's the person telling the story, you focus on the individual story, or you've got a large issue, but you focus on an anecdote that will make it relatable. So, for example, this I Stand With Randy campaign, this made this is a Nebraska rancher and helped make the Keystone XL pipeline fight very relatable. And the other one here is a picture of someone who's actually on the line right now, Leanne Walker from the Elk River Alliance. And so when she attended the engagement organizing training we did last summer, and so we worked through this Marshall Gann's public narrative, and there's 3 pieces of it of your public narrative, and there's the story of self, and there's the story of us, and there's the story of now, and you work on all of these, and it's perhaps the most challenging one, I don't know, is the story of self, because you may not think that you have a story, but all of you, doing the work you do, you all have a story, and every organization has a personal founding story. And so what we did, and this is something that's easier to do in person than online, is we as a group of 4 people, we divided them up, and actually Katie was in my group, and so was Leanne, and we each started telling our story, and you'd have to, a very short amount of time, you'd have to try to do it in 2 minutes to tell your story of self, and then later we would do and of now, and you realize that one, it's a hard thing to boil it down to 2 minutes, and you start maybe doing autobiographical, I did this and did that. But with Leanne, we hit on, or she hit on and realized that what resonated was this story of learning how to, 30 years ago, learning how to fish with this older gentleman, and who taught her all the details and how to think like a fish. And the cool thing was, it's great, and it's just a single camera, one shot, so anybody can do this. And Leanne does a good job of telling us why it's important, without the technical details of monitoring, but with convincing details. She talks about the caddisflies and other stuff that you can picture her learning this. And we had some groups that did storytelling training participate in this crowdfunding campaign, this National Freshwater Fund, and that's where Leanne created this video and put it up there, and for their water monitoring program, and they raised more than their intended goal through that. And I think having this video, the simple video of your story of self, And again, it doesn't have to be when you're doing, this helps when it's like a video or an in-person presentation. It doesn't always have to be you. You might want to consider who the messenger is for your audience. Sometimes it might be your volunteers. You might have someone who might relate more than your executive director. And you want them to, for doing an interview, you want to have them or show them, dress their part. I mean, here's Leanne right by the river, just the river that she loves, as opposed to being in an office. So you really want to think about resonating with your audience with that. So after you think about making it relatable, make the connection. So this is where Gan's story of us. This is how you have your story, but as you're thinking about your story, you've got to make it connect to other people. And the example that I sent out in the recommended viewing list, this included the speech by this guy, James Croft, who gave this speech at Harvard. Part of this It Gets Better campaign on LGBT issues, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender issues. And hopefully some of you watched this. And he has a good story of self. Talks about him, why doing ballet, but he loved it, but with some humor and tease for it. And it's good to use humor even if it's a very intense topic. And he later talks about how he wished he'd come out sooner, because every day he didn't come out as a teacher, he was depriving a gay student of a role model. And the thing that I found, it's a pretty moving video. So if you haven't watched it, I do recommend that you do it. It's his story of us. So his audience is not just the Gay Student Alliance at Harvard right there. It's general student population, or maybe the town. I don't know. But he has these lines like, "We all know what it feels like to be alone." He talks about whether or not you were too tall, or too small, or too smart, or too dumb, or the wrong race, and all this. And he connects this with something that's universal, that people feel. It's why the Stone Soup story resonates with people who feel this longing and separateness and this sense of scarcity when there is abundance around. He also does a great job of using vivid imagery. Talks about it's pretty intense, but he talks about these 12 and 13-year-old boys who hung themselves. He talks about them twisting in the wind. And he says, again, this connecting to the story of us, it could have been your brother, sister, son, daughter, your friend. It could have been one of us. So in your stories, again, think about how do you, if it's your story or the story of someone that you're profiling, how does that story relate? Not just of interest, but what are those things that can connect with you, again, emotionally and through these sense of shared values. So, and then make a clear and urgent ask. So the next thing you do is the story of now, which is the urgent choice of why you want to, that people need to make. And so to do that, you convey the dream and the nightmare, right? The vision of what will happen, right? I mean, here's this campaign for local power video, which I also shared. And then you want to also, convey that nightmare of what will happen if you don't. Now, this group, we actually had them on part of the storytelling intensive, the guy who did this video, and they didn't intentionally use GANs, but they do throughout this video work on the story of self, their story, the us. Actually, the opening line is, "This is a story about something that is happening in every community across the U.S. and what one community is doing to fight about." This is about democracy. This is about David versus Goliath. It's about our planet and health versus corporate greed. This is a story that just might be the shot across the bow for how our society finally addresses climate change. So they tie it all together, and one thing to think about when you're doing the story of self, us, and now, it's when you do this practice and you hone it down, break the different pieces, and when you put it together, you don't have to put it into that order. That'll be something we get to in a minute, but just how you order things. But you want to, when you make it urgent, you want to make sure there's this clear and urgent ask, and not a lot of them. research, there used to be, the books would come out, 50 things you can do to save the environment. Well, it turns out that that's just too many. People want to focus on maybe one or maybe two things. And so at the end of this, toward the end of this video, the Campaign for Local Power, which was in Colorado, they were fighting, they basically had created their own public utility, and the power company was challenging it, and there was going to be an election to take away the ability to do it, and they were rallying people for this election. And so they used wording such as, the only way David beats Goliath this time is with your help, because the only way to counter money is with people. Ironically, they asked for money to hire organizers that can recruit volunteers, and they say, we are here to recruit you. Right now, more than ever, we need you. Your financial support will help restore our community's voice in this election. And this story, it didn't take all that much money to put together, and they had a goal of $40,000 to raise, and they raised over $200,000, and from all across the world, actually. And people, my colleague Raj Gills, when she saw that, she just she wanted to head right to Colorado and help out. It's an inspiring story, and they do a great job throughout it of connecting with the sense of us, but making it really clear that there's a lot at stake, and they've got a clear and urgent ask. All right. So, but when you're putting together the story, you've done all these other pieces, but so how do you put it together? And so don't bury the lead. And here's a little example that was in the Made to Stick book, which is a great example that I think I learned something very close to this when I was in journalism school. But here's this example. Okay, so you're given this, they take new journalism students and they give it some information. So here's this information. Basically, this principal of the high school announced today that the high school faculty will be traveling to Sacramento next Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Among the speakers, anthropologist Margaret Mead, college president Robert Maynard Hutchins, and the California governor. Okay, so they're given this and they're asked, okay, so here's the information. What's the lead? How do you start your story? And as a journalist, often I would spend maybe half my time writing the lead. So in this exercise that actually happened, all the students just talked about, next Thursday the faculty is going to be hearing from these great speakers. So they had just versions of just that. But you know what? So what is the lead? If you're writing for the school paper, there will be no school on Thursday. So one, it's a way to get people's attention, but that is really the key information that you need to convey. So anyway, I just thought that was a good thing when you start thinking about how you organize your story. And so the final recommendation here as you're putting it together is try to be creative, make it memorable. This one I just saw yesterday, this new campaign that came out. So you start watching it, and these two people meet over trying to reach for the last tortilla chip in a bowl at a party, and they go on and have a relationship where there's just Doritos in the bathtub, and they drink milk over Doritos in bed, and inside a bag of Doritos is where the wedding ring is. And they have all these, they're just having the time of their life, and they get come from. And they're walking through the forest, and they come to this. Also, they come to this clearing, and it's basically a clear cut in the rainforest because Doritos uses palm oil, and palm oil, the practices of the company that they're using that makes Doritos, it's not sustainable. So, so there's, this is an ad campaign. It's pretty effective. It's something you're going to remember, right? It's a lasting. You want to have something memorable, a lasting image that people can easily recall and reminds them of the core message. So it can be often saying the unexpected. You want to get their attention. You want to break their patterns. Another way to do it is to make it a mystery. And so that to entice the reader or the viewer to follow along. That come along from the ride. There's this idea you can move from common sense to uncommon sense. But so, anyways, that was it's a good idea to figure out. You want to get their attention right away. So, all right. So I think that's kind of my summary for now. Here's a quote from Hannah Arendt: "Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it." And again, I think anybody can do this. Leanne did I really wanted to have her video there as an example of, with just a little bit of practice. And I don't know how many takes Leanne did, but it's just, it's super low budget. The camera just rolls, and she has some notes, but she tells her story, and it being very effective. So just consider your audience and be authentic. So I guess it's time now for questions.
Hi, David. Yeah, thank you so much. That was extremely insightful, and yeah, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to enlighten us today. I would encourage everyone to put a question in the chat box if you have one. To kick things off, I definitely have a question for you, David. I like the point that you made about making the audience the hero, and I was just wondering if you could maybe provide an example of this.
Let me think about this. I don't. Well, I'm just thinking back to those. Just that's the Stone Soup story again. That you make, that they all are all an ingredient. Is certainly an example, but I'm trying to think of an example of a story. All right. But again, so the idea is it's what the audience needs to do. That they're the ones who are waking up and taking action. So, yeah. God, let me think. I'll think if I can even come up with an example. I also will be sending out some additional resources, and if I think of some good audience stories, I'm just drawing a blank. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Is sometimes when you make the audience the hero sort of like the outcome, like in the example of the Colorado power example?
Yeah, and also sometimes having it resonate, that you identify with people. So that video, that campaign for local power, they're showing, it's just really, they have all these kind of just almost kind of stills, close-ups of all these different faces. So, if it goes just for the people in Boulder, then you resonate with those people, like, because there's someone there who maybe looks, that you connect to. So by focusing on all these different people, you get a sense that it's the larger community. But yeah, no, it's more about what you can do. But yeah, let me think of a better example.
Okay. We have a question from Michelle, and her question is, if you had one activity to help people become good storytellers, what would it be? She works with a group of researchers, and will be giving some communication to them, training to them in the near future. And given that they do lots of presentations, she thinks that storytelling would be an important element to drive home. So do you have a short activity that's possibly 20 to 30 minutes that could help in her work?
Yeah. Well, probably again this Marshall Gans thing, especially the even starting with the story of self, because when you're introducing yourself at a presentation, again, everybody's got a story of something that moved them, that you can tie it to to the work that they're doing. So the idea would be that you would sit down with somebody else. You give each other 5 minutes to just jot down some thoughts. So you don't not take a lot of time. So 5 minutes, everybody writes down what they think their story is, and try to convey it to each other in 2 minutes. And when you tell it to another person, they're timing you, but they don't say anything. Just kind of be neutral. And after those 2 minutes, then you get 2 minutes to give them feedback. And then that person can do that with you. and you repeat it one more time, you give them another 5 minutes to refine it. And you realize how many things that you had in there you thought were core, and you cut it out, and maybe there's just a few details that you play up. So I think that's, and again, while thinking about who your audience is, because I've never used that stone soup anecdote before. I've used some other ones when I've done it, and I just ingest it to the audience. But yeah, I think that just that practice of giving yourself a very short amount of time that helps you identify the core, especially after you have to say it to somebody, practice it, and then do it again.
Yeah, I definitely, when we were doing that training with you, David, I found that was a really helpful exercise because, yeah, you kind of get into sometimes a situation of just regurgitating your biography of kind of, what education you have and what things, but some of the actual kind of core experiences that lead you to kind of wanting to do this work or being engaged in certain initiative is really interesting. And I like just the example in the 6.12 seconds video where yeah, he describes the kind of situation of being a ballerina with the hardwood floor and the old piano, and some of those things really evoke emotion and made me kind of transport back to some of my childhood and the things that I had gone through. And so, yeah, it's thinking about those details sometimes is kind of the challenge, and it was, yeah, that would be a really good process, I think, to go through with a group of researchers and scientists.
And it's what you remember. I mean, I remember from when you were in the group, I remember your story, the big event that happened for you.
Yeah, exactly, and that's kind of what sticks. Yeah.
Do or what your whole story was about, but going back to that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Sally has a question.
Really, these stories make you remember. I think it's yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sally's question is, how do we get a sensory receptiveness from an individual given the deluge of distracting information or disinformation and sensory input from most people now experience, and how to set up that situation?
I don't know, because I mean, it's that previous slide was about being creative and do things to break their patterns to get them interested. But you don't want to be over the top with that, and we're all bombarded. Because I do think that again, part of it is being authentic. No, I mean it's super hard. There's so much stuff, but we still can get engrossed in a story, in a storyline, and I think it's a story of people. I mean, there's a magazine, People magazine. People want to hear stories, and so when they feel like somebody is opening up to them and not trying to sell them, and you want to find out a little bit more, and like I said, even having this sense of mystery, but it's super hard to get their attention initially. But by being clear on your core idea, with a using a proverb or some kind of something that you can really boil down, I think you can get their attention. No, it's hard. I don't know. I mean, think of how much money gets put into ads and how many of them bomb. So, I mean, the main thing is to experiment, be true to yourself, and not lose sight of that core idea, because that core idea should be something that will resonate. I don't know if that helps. Thanks for the question, Sally.
Okay, well, we can give a few more minutes for questions to trickle in, but I know that, Dave, you were going to provide the audience a little bit of an intro to some of the Canadian Freshwater Alliance webinars that are coming up. And then maybe after that, if there's some more questions, we can finish off the session with those. So if you have more questions, audience, please put them in the chat box.
Okay, and I also will tell another story that I've saved that if there was time, just the power of storytelling. But here's just some slides just about our trainings at the Freshwater Alliance. So we do these intro webinars on different topics, including storytelling. We have these intensive, these online intensives. There's going to be a 4-part storytelling one probably in late April. The dates aren't solidified with that, where we meet for 4 weeks for like an hour and a half online and work through stories. We have these communities of practice, and we also have one-on-one coaching, which more groups are starting to take advantage of. And so it's a great way to really focus on something specifically that you're working on. So there's all these things that we do coaching on. So planning for impact, right? How to develop your theory of change, and you work on your business model and how to measure what it is. And then there's all the communication things like identifying your audience and doing a communications audit. I did a communications audit when I joined the Alliance, and it's quite insightful. And then how to deal with traditional media. I did our Living Waters Rally, which we do every 2 years, and we'll be in Vancouver in 2016. I don't have a slide on that yet. I did one on media jujitsu about just taking news stories and how to, existing stories, and how to pivot, help them pivot to get your message out. So something to think about and work on social media. And we have Gauging Your Persuadables, which our director Lindsay Telfer led one yesterday, but it's just, again, you see the story is part of it, and power mapping, and how you can develop an engagement pyramid and work with volunteers, again, who are a good source of stories. You probably, especially anybody who's volunteering, right? It's one thing to get find a job that will pay the bills, but someone who's doing a volunteer, they have stories. And I would recommend that you talk to your volunteers and find out what their story is, and there may be one that you really want to highlight, or many. And then in managing and mobilizing your constituency with these different databases and things, and how to do fundraising and building your donor base. So we do that, and we have some upcoming webinars. It's not just about the election, but we want to, there's going to be a lot of engagement going on, and so we have a bunch the next month. Again, you can tell there's story is a big part of what we do. How to elevate Canada's freshwater story, an intro to list building, an intro to storytelling, which participants in that will get a discount for the storytelling intensive that will happen later. So that same thing will happen with those who do the intro to theory of change. They'll get a 20% discount off of being the intensive that we're doing the theory of change. We're getting over the charity chill, kind of letting you know what charities need to know, what you can and can't do around elections, so that there are more things that you can do, but you want to be careful to do only you can, what you should be doing. And then we'll have a bunch of stuff going on for Canada Water Week. All right, if there are any other questions, I can just tell one final story, and a little thank you thing. So I was just reading an article, just thinking about the holidays, an article I first saw it on CNN, about how in the early 1800s in New York, there was a problem with Christmas. That apparently the Christian leaders there, and this is actually true in some other places as well, they've been against religious celebrations because they thought it was too paganish. And this wasn't just in New York, but apparently in England and other parts of the United States. And that the Christmas was characterized by raucous, drunken mobs roaming the streets, damaging property. So a group of New Yorkers, including Washington Irving, they wanted to domesticate Christmas. So they formed the St. Nicholas Society of New York, and they took the idea of St. Nicholas that some cultures still had a bit of, and been visiting. It was actually earlier in December. So Irving wrote a book in 1809 called The Knickerbocker's History of New York, which was portrayed a pipe-smoking St. Nicholas soaring over the rooftops in a flag and delivering presents to good girls and boys and switches to bad ones. And then in 1821, which is this picture here, there's an anonymous illustrated poem entitled "The Children's Friend" that introduced Santa Claus. It has an E instead of an A. That wasn't a typo. In this role, and it featured a birch rod that directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse. And it was pulled by a single reindeer, and then a year later, The Night Before Christmas came out. But it basically changed this having a story of Santa Claus changed how people create Christmas. It became a family thing, and it inspired people to behave well as opposed to a chance just to go out and celebrate. So there's a sense of Santa Claus, and there's one of these early versions of what Santa Claus looked like from the night before Christmas. So that's the bonus story.
Excellent.
And also, just by the way, sorry.
Okay, I'm just reading through a question. Maybe we'll just end with one more here, and then we can be true to everyone's time and finish this up at 11 Pacific. So Megan asks, let's say your goal is to gather personal stories from the public about their connections to their watershed. I'm thinking about how we gently coax these out. What kinds of questions do you find inspire stories rather than just answers? Do you foresee concerns regarding gray ethical areas of using these stories respectfully and effectively?
Okay. Well, the second one, you have to get their permission to use things, right? I mean, so when even when doing these slides, since it's going to be a public presentation, I have to make sure that things are copyrighted. So there's a site called Creative Commons that has images that you can use that aren't copyright issues. So I pretty much try to use those. And so in terms of you want to make sure you get permission. But there's and there's something that we've been trying to work a project called story mapping, where you go out and record these stories. You get their permission. But yeah, it's not. And then you can map on your area that here are these different stories in your community. But yeah, no, asking, you don't want people don't want to feel like they're interviewed, right? Because that can be off-putting, especially if you do the person on the street kind of an interview. So the type of questions is more tell us something, not why do you support this, or and you get them to think back to something and describe something. So, I mean, you certainly don't want to ask a yes/no question, and it's really not even a question. It's more of an invitation to describe something. Tell us. Can you tell us why you're here, or why and even just get a warm-up question. I mean, really, because people do want to talk, and especially if you can get them to start talking about themselves and not just pontificating on their opinions. So again, don't ask yes/no questions, and make it more of an inviting. I hope that helps, Megan. And anybody wants to connect with me as well, ask me individual questions. My contact info is right here as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, David, and thanks for all the attendees online for participating in this webinar. Yeah, we will post a recording of this webinar if you want to view it again or share it with any of your contacts or your organizations. And thank you very much. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, guys.